Hey, geometry students, now we're going to look at parallelogram properties. There's four major properties you're going to see. Number one, opposite sides are congruent. Number two, opposite angles are congruent. Number three, consecutive angles are supplementary. If you remember, consecutive means they're right next to each other, and supplementary means they add up to 180. And this fourth one is the diagonals bisect each other. And so we're going to use all of these properties to solve our questions. So for all the questions we do, the directions are find all the missing angles and solve for x and y. So here we go. Let's look at this number one, which is right here. They gave us the A is 70 degrees. So let's just start labeling everything we know. The first thing that we see of our rules, number one, is that opposite sides are congruent. Well, what's that mean? Well, let's highlight our opposite sides. We've got 15. Which side is opposite of 15? Well, it's our y, right? And then which side is opposite 12? Well, it's x. So using rule number one, the opposite sides are congruent, we can say that 15 equals y, and we can say 12 equals x. So that's just using that first property. Right? Let's look at the second property. It says opposite angles are congruent. Well, let's go ahead and look. Which angle is opposite 70 degrees? Now you want to think opposite, not next to. If you go opposite, it's C, right? So using property number two, that opposite angles are congruent, I can say that angle C equals angle A, right? CC, BCA. And therefore angle C equals 70 degrees. So that's using the second property. Now let's look at the third property. The third property says consecutive angles are supplementary. Consecutive means right next to one another. So if this is 70, what's the consecutive angles? Well, it could be either D or B, right? And we know they're the same because they're opposite angles. So that means if I add this 70 and this angle D, I'm going to get 180. So using the third property, we can say 70 plus angle D is going to give us 180. We'll subtract 70 from both sides, and you'll solve that angle D equals, not 180 degrees, angle D equals 110. And since angle D is 110, we can use theorem 2 that says the opposite angles are congruent, right? So now angle B is congruent. So you can go through just using the different properties, and you can solve any question. So let's go ahead, let's look at number 2, where it looks like it's going to get a little more complicated, but not really. We're going to go through the same process. So here, I'm going to give us some room like that. The same thing. We'll go through each theorem. So the first one, I keep calling it a theorem. Theorem and property mean the same thing, so I'll call them properties from now on. Property number 1 is opposite sides are equal. So that means 10 over here is equal to this 5x minus 5. And this 12 is equal to 2y minus 4, because they're opposites. So now let's write this down. We have 12 equals 2y minus 4. And we also have 10 equals 5x minus 5. And now it just becomes solving an equation, which you all have gotten really good at this year. So we'll plus the 4 on both sides, and you'll divide by 2, and you'll get y equals 8. So we just solved that this y equals 8. And then over on the other side, we can solve for x doing something very similar, right? Add 5x equals 15. I end up with x equals 3. So I just solved for x and y right there, using our property, our first property, that opposite sides are congruent. Well, now, here's the tricky part. The second one says what? That opposite angles are congruent. Well, I see that we have a 45 here, and then we have this 35 right here. But you can't just say, but wait a minute, we can find out the whole angle, right? What's 45 plus 35? Do it quick in your head. It's 80. This whole angle is 80 degrees. Which angle is opposite A? Well, that's C. This whole angle is 80 degrees. So we can say angle, once again, angle A is equal to angle C. And we know that 80 is equal to 80 degrees. And now we're going to talk about the smaller angles in a moment, but I want to go ahead and jump to property number 3. Because I think property number 3 might help you to see what I'm going to say about those smaller angles. Remember, I'm going to put property number 3 over here. Property number 3 says consecutive angles are supplementary. So that means all of angle A and all of angle D, when I add those up, it's going to equal 180 degrees. What does all of angle A equal? 80 degrees, right? Plus angle D will give us 180. And so if you subtract 80 from both sides, angle D is 100 degrees. And then we know from theorem, or from property 2, that opposite angles are congruent. What angle is opposite D? Oh, it's B. So that's 100 degrees. And now, in order for you to see what these smaller angles are in C, now you can't just draw a straight line and say, oh, 35 would go here, 45 would go there. That's not how it works. Instead, you have to look at these triangles, right? You have 100 here, plus 35. This angle ends up being 45 degrees, and this angle ends up being 35 degrees. If you remember back to what you learned about angles in the beginning, this diagonal right here is almost like a transversal, remember that? So you have the 45s on the opposite sides. If you don't want to remember that, just look at it like smaller triangles, right? There's this triangle right here, and that triangle right there. And you can solve for the smaller pieces. It looks crazy, but it's really not. If you want to see something a little crazier, let's look at the next problem. Whoa, Mr. Elizondo, this is looking wild. Don't stress. Let's look at number 1. Once again, we said that opposite sides are equal. That's what we've been saying. So that means this side is equal to this side, and that means this side is equal to this side. But what can we call it? Well, if this is y, and it's equal to this side, what can we call this side? We can call it y. So both sides are y. It kind of looks like an x. So we can label both sides y. So now, let's see what we have. We have 6y plus 12 equals 8y minus 20. And then we have this y equals y, but we don't really know what to do with that. So here, let's try to solve for our y's with this one. We've got to get our y's on the same side. So we get 12 equals 2y minus 20. And then we want to move the 20 over. We get 2y equals 32. Divide by 2. Y equals 16. So if y equals 16 from these, we can also use it over here, right? Because y is the variable, so we could plug in that 16 anywhere there's a y. So that means if we wanted to find the length of each side, we know that these are 16. And then to find these other sides, you just plug in 16 to find them, right? And now, what's our second property? Our second property is that opposite angles are congruent. But when I look at this problem, I don't really have any opposite angles yet. So that's okay. Sometimes you don't have to go right in order. So let's skip ahead to number 3. I'm going to write number 3 over here, and then maybe we'll come back to 2. Number 3 says that if we have consecutive angles, they're supplementary. But we do have consecutive angles. Look, we have angle D and angle C. Remember, angle D is this whole piece. Angle C is this whole piece. So I know if I do angle D plus angle C, I'll get 180 degrees. Well, angle D is that whole thing. So it's 25 plus 5x. And angle C is that whole thing, which is 30 plus 50, which is 80. Combine our like terms. We have 105 plus 5x equals 180. When we subtract 105 from each side, we get 5x equals 75. When we divide both sides by 5, so with x equaling 13, we can go back up to our parallelogram. We can plug in 13 for x, so 5 times 13 is going to give us 75. And so now we know what those smaller angles are, each one. We have the 25, now 75, a 30, and a 50. And now we can go back to that number 2. Remember we skipped it before, where we said property 2 has been opposite angles are congruent, right? So angle D is opposite of what? Angle B, right? So angle D is going to be congruent to angle B, and that means angle A is going to be congruent to angle C. Now we're talking about the whole thing, right? So angle D is 100, and angle B is going to have to equal 100. So they have to be equal to each other. And angle C is 80. Oh, don't mean the angle sign there. Just want 80 degrees. Sorry about that. We just want degrees. And we know that it's going to be 80 degrees over here. And then if you remember what I showed you in the last problem, you can do it one of 2 ways. You can either go ahead and solve those smaller triangles, or you can just remember that across the diagonal, just like we had the problems with angles where it was cut down the middle. So here, I'll show you a picture. Remember that? We did a bunch of these. Like this angle is equal to that one. It's on the opposite side. That means this up here is 30. This right here is 50. I'm just flipping them. See that? And then this up here is 75. And this right here is 25. Now this last problem looks hard, but you follow the exact same process that I just did up there, only it's just a little more algebra. I want you to try it on your own. If not, if you can't figure it out, ask Siegel or myself. But we wish you the best of luck. Parallelograms, we tried something a little different. We tried to show you that if you could figure everything out, then it doesn't matter what question they ask you. But try your best. We'll see what happens, and you all are going to do great on this.